Quest of the Giant J. Chapter 1, The Quest begins. Ben was working as a sales engineer representing some of the largest CNC machine builders in the world, while, in his spare time, pursuing his hobby interests of music and archaeology. He graduated with honors from Northern Illinois University in December 2001 with a Bachelor's of Science degree in Business Management along with an emphasis in technology and archaeology. After graduation, in his spare time, Ben began recording songs that he had written on guitar over the years and released 2 full albums between 2003 and 2005. His career was going well in the machine tool industry as a sales engineer, and he had surpassed his $1 million quota in sales. Just before Thanksgiving in 2005, Ben received a call from the senior VP of Warner Brothers Music, who had given him great reviews on his second album and discussed the potential for a record deal. Ben was encouraged to keep playing and make another album, which he began compiling after work in 2006. It was also around this time that he began researching potential treasure stories and archaeology sites near his home in the suburbs of Chicago. Ben had already done extensive research into his Native American heritage, which was inspired by an event that took place when he was a young boy. Ben was being pushed back and forth in a circle of second graders when he was in third grade and was being called names and being used as a human football. His eyes started to tear. As tears started to come to the surface, he looked up at the kids in the circle, and to his amazement, Ben saw another circle of old Indians that had surrounded the older third grade kids, although they could not see the Indians. Ben's eyes connected with one old Indian in particular, and the Indian spoke to Ben through telepathy without actually speaking. He said, "You are one of us, and you better start acting like it." The next thing Ben knew was that his body was moving up and down and his legs started dancing. He was doing a dance that he had never been taught before. Energy came over his whole body as if he were plugged into an electrical outlet. The older kids immediately recognized this as a Native American attribute, and the smallest of the older kids said, "Holy crap, it's a wild Indian." Ben then turned and punched the tallest kid in the face, and then turned and punched the smallest kid. The others started to run as Ben turned towards them with absolutely no more fear. Ben was more worried about disappointing the old Indians that nobody could see because he recognized their power as something obviously very powerful. After that day, the third grade never picked on the second graders again, and Ben would remember that day for the rest of his life. It was really the old Indians that had left the impression in his mind that maybe he was related to them since they said he was one of them. In fact, Ben did eventually learn that he was part Native American when he was a bit older and was eventually told on his 21st birthday by his grandmother on his father's side that he was Apache. By the time Ben finally found out what tribe he was related to, he had already done extensive research on native cultures of all kinds and was fascinated by the history and cultures of such brave people. He had also recently verified a relation to 2 Indian chiefs, and one of them being the famous Chief Victorio aka Apache Wolf of the Chiricahua Apache. This whole experience of understanding who he was inevitably guided Ben in the future with the notion that you should care about your ancestors and who they were. Because even though you may not have ever met them, they care for you and watch out for you and can even help you like they did that day on the playground. Ben was told by his other grandmother on his mother's side that they were related to Andrew Jackson, and she had been told by her grandmother. Of course, his reaction out of shock was, "You mean Andrew Jackson the president? The guy on the $20 bill? The Army General of Tennessee?" Yes, that is the same Andrew Jackson that she was talking about, and he would certainly find out the truth soon enough with the help of his Apache tracking capabilities, which seemed to be somewhat hereditary for some reason. Ben was pretty good at investigating and tracking things for some reason, and he knew it was one of his natural abilities. When he was a young boy, occasionally his grandma would mention that her grandpa Jack had lots of land somewhere and that he was a big hillbilly from Tennessee. As a young boy, the term hillbilly carried a somewhat negative feeling along with it for some reason. It would be many years later that Ben would learn the true meaning and origination of the name, which seemed to completely change the once negative image in his mind. The term hillbilly originated in Northern Ireland and was used to describe the groups of Scots-Irish settlers that had settled in the hills of Northern Ireland. Ben was looking at family pictures and documents that his grandmother had received from her grandpa Jack. It appeared the land that had been mentioned by his grandma in the past actually had some photos associated with it. Ben studied these photos intensely and certainly recognized that these were old photos and from another time when life was maybe less complex in some ways, but also more difficult in many other ways. Ben wondered what his great-great-grandfather could teach him about life and survival from an 1890s or early 1900s perspective, which is around the time the photos were taken. Ben's grandma wasn't sure where exactly the property was located, but the log home picture had the Black Hills written on the back, and she knew that was her grandpa Jackson's gold mine property, where her mother was raised until age 5. It appeared there were also a few people in the fort picture that were wearing Civil War hats, or military hats of some kind, but Ben's grandmother was not aware if her grandpa Jackson was in the military or not, but she was positive that he owned the gold mining business that he was involved with in South Dakota, and that it was his biggest venture. But she also mentioned that he was involved with many businesses over the years and was also involved in building the first movie theater on Chicago's North Side after the gold mining days. Ben was confused as to why his grandma didn't really seem all that interested in this black and white photo of a gold mine operation. She apparently thought it was her grandfather's old sawmill operation and didn't realize this larger sawmill photo was actually the gold mining operation and a military fortification for the famous Jackson Brigade headquarters. Her grandpa Jackson had also turned the business in the Black Hills into a sawmill operation as well. She didn't realize that the large building photo was actually the gold mining operation before the sawmill had been added yet. Ben's grandmother was told she was related to General Andrew Jackson, but she always thought of it as a joke for some reason. Ben was beginning to see very quickly how easy it is for family information to be lost over time or forgotten like an old watch that gets put in a drawer for years or decades. Ben's grandma made the promise that if he could find the property and if there was anything of value left, she would grant him the entire Jackson estate, which she rightfully inherited from her grandparents in the 1950s. Ben had read an article about private properties, sometimes called federal enclaves, located in federal jurisdiction that were immune to state taxation. Sometimes military officers were compensated with land as payment for services rendered. Congress didn't intend for these pioneers to pay property taxes for county resources they would never use, while settling the Wild West on desolate mountains in national forests virtually far from any resources that the county provided. These people settling these federal mineral patents were in the middle of nowhere for the most part, and often within range of hostile Indian country. Ben thought that if he was related to General Andrew Jackson, then it is possible that his great-great-grandpa Jackson acquired property in federal jurisdiction, and was possibly also in the military. His grandma wasn't sure if he was military or not, she said, but he played the fiddle and owned a lot of businesses on the north side of Chicago after the gold rush days. The bottom line is that this mining property is probably located on a mountain somewhere, and Ben's grandmother has never had the need or desire to visit. Her mother was conceived and raised on the property, but she herself had never been there. So there was a sense of generational detachment that Ben had to comprehend before learning more. She is telling Ben that no other male in the family has been to her grandfather's gold mine in the Black Hills since he shut the operation down in the 1900s. Ben felt pretty confident for some reason that if he could only find this place, there was a chance that this property was a federal enclave in federal jurisdiction. He also felt like it would be pretty cool to see the spot where his second great-grandpa had built his cabin in the middle of nowhere on a mountain. Ben started to think about survival and how he thought his grandpa Jack, who appeared to be a tall, slender hillbilly from Tennessee, seemed to know a lot about surviving off the land in very mountainous terrain. There were mountains visible in both the cabin and Fort Gold Mill picture. Ben thought this whole situation was strange, but immediately thought the odds of being related to Andrew Jackson were looking pretty possible after all, just based on the size of this fort. He wasn't positive that it was even a fort yet, but he was pretty positive that at least 2 people in the photo were wearing Civil War hats or officer hats, and his grandpa Jackson was wearing a Tennessee or Missouri type disc hat that was similar to what Jesse James was reported to wear. Ben noticed his grandpa Jackson looked like a big hillbilly from Tennessee and actually had some very similar facial features, like the nose that was a prominent Irish trait that was prevalent in much of the Jackson side of Ben's family. Ben's great-great-grandpa Jackson and his grandma both had the exact same nose features as Andrew Jackson. Then he compared photos of General Stonewall Jackson, who had claimed to be second cousins to Andrew Jackson, but historians have had difficulty linking them in the family tree. Ben could see that Stonewall had the exact same long Nordic nose facial features as well. He thought, well, that is strange, but it could just be a Scotch-Irish thing since he knew for sure that Andrew Jackson was at least Scotch-Irish, just like his grandpa Jackson. Ben set out to find this property that had been lost in the family photos and history since the 1950s. So how do you find a piece of property when you have to search 100 square miles of the Black Hills as your perimeter? First of all, the fort photo says Tennessee on the back, but he can tell that it's most likely in the Black Hills, just like the cabin, which also has mountains in the background, and his grandpa Jack is wearing the same outfit in both pictures. Ben thought the women in his family were amateur investigators at best, so why be surprised? Ben's college degree has a minor in archaeology, so he already had a natural interest in history and investigating the past civilizations. This was going to be a great little investigative challenge as an archaeologist, Ben thought to himself. And also as a genealogist, if he can prove that he is related to Andrew Jackson like his grandma was told, that would be a very cool thing to verify as well. In 2007, Ben ordered several land entry files from the National Archives to verify the owners of the mineral and land patents issued to the Jackson surname. He ordered the original entry files for every patent issued to John or Jack Jackson in the Black Hills region. The actual land patents themselves can be ordered separately for $1.50 each from the Bureau of Land Management, but they generally only have the owner's name and location of the property. With a name like John or Jack Jackson, this could prove to be more difficult than originally thought. Ben checked about 14 files and did not find his grandparents listed in any of them. Well, where the hell is this land then? He said to himself. It then occurred to him that since the fort or mill building in the old photo was so huge, the patent could have been issued under his grandfather's business name. It also occurred to him that the Dakota Territory originally included Montana and North Dakota as well. Then he thought, what if it's not in South Dakota at all? This really was turning out to be a challenge. If he can't find the property, there will be no way to determine the ownership of the Jackson estate. Ben asked his grandma if she knew the name of her grandfather's company, but she could not remember anything other than it was his biggest business venture, including building the first Nickelodeon movie theater on Chicago's North Side. Ben ordered more land patents and continued the search. He ordered every patent of relevance to his grandpa Jackson's name located in the original Dakota Territory, adding a huge stack of paperwork to his desk in his already clustered home office. Ben checked them all and again came up empty. None of the federal census info for the Black Hills had his family on it either after doing a thorough check. That just didn't make any sense, he thought. He looked at the picture of the fort, which he had blown up to a 4-foot poster for his office wall above the bulletin board. He would shout at the picture and say, "Jack, where are you?" If pictures could talk, he bet this one would be able to, possibly. None of the patents were a match. It had to be under the business name, and that was going to be very difficult to find out without the location. Ben was starting to lose his patience with this treasure hunt, not to mention the small fortune in patent and archive fees was now over $200. Ben started to think the whole thing is bullshit. He couldn't find anything in the history books about a Colonel Jackson after the Lieutenant General Stonewall was killed in the Civil War in 1863. He thought about giving up the search and putting all this stuff back in the drawer for a rainy day. Ben had been searching for this property in his free time for almost 2 years now. It certainly wasn't his job, but in many ways was starting to feel like a part-time job. Ben couldn't drop the issue. It was nagging at him every day. He couldn't stand the thought of failing as an archaeologist and not being able to track down the location of his family property. He started to realize that it was his responsibility because his grandma had 3 daughters who never would have been interested in this old mining business anyway. Ben caught a second wind and realized that he had what it takes to get something like this done, when most people would have given up after 2 weeks or 2 months. Ben was still going strong after 2 years of intense research. He had accumulated a massive wealth of info on the history of land acquisition in the United States. He had studied the military tactics used by Army colonels and various generals engaged in guerrilla warfare throughout hostile Indian country. He learned that the fierce Apache skills and masterful tactics of guerrilla warfare were first recorded in the field by Army officers and then retaught to potential generals at West Point Military Academy out of a 400-page manifesto. Ben, being part Apache himself, has always held an interest related to anything Native American. The American Western frontier was a wild and unforgiving place that had little or no rules until the creation of territories which were put under the command of a federal territorial colonel. Ben started to talk with other archaeologists in the region that maybe had a better knowledge of the history of the Dakota Territory. He figured back to square one. We have to use the picture, he thought. No one will recognize the cabin photo, but the fort is a huge building. Someone has to know where this was located. The photo has got to be connected to a land or mineral patent of some kind. As part of the method by which the new United States decided to dispose of its territories, it created in the Constitution an article, section, and clause that specifically dealt with such disposals. Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2 states in part, "The Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States." Thus, Congress was given the power to create a vehicle to divest the federal government of all its right and interest in the land. This vehicle, known as the Land Patent, was to forever divest the federal government of its land and was to place such total ownership in the hands of the sovereign freeholders who collectively created the government. The land patents issued prior to the initial date of recognition of the United States Constitution were ratified by the members of Constitutional Congress. Those patents created by statute after March 1789 had only the power of the statutes and the congressional intent behind such statutes as a reference and basis for the determination of their powers and operational effect originally and in the American system of land ownership today. As has been seen, man is always striving to protect his rights, the most dear being the absolute right to ownership of the land. This right was guaranteed by the land patent, the public policy of the Congress, and the legislative intent behind the statutes at large. Such rights must be reacquired through the redeclaration of the patent in the color of title claimant's name, based on his color of title and possession. With such reborn rights, the land is protected from the forced sale because of delinquency on a promissory note and foreclosure on the mortgage. This protected land will not eliminate the debt. A trust must be created whereby partners will work together to repay it. These rights must be recaptured from the state legislated laws, or the freedoms guaranteed in the Bill of Rights and Constitution will be lost. Once lost, those rights will be exceedingly hard to reclaim, and quite possibly, as Thomas Jefferson said, the children of this generation may someday wake up homeless on the land their forefathers founded. On a different note, Ben had also been given a badge and gun that was framed by his grandma and had been in the family for many years, but the story behind it was not quite clear. The badge and gun were in the home office of a second cousin to Ben's great-grandmother and belonged to her husband, who was a retired Chicago police sergeant. Years ago, Ben had made a few calls to try and determine who the badge was issued to, but did not have any luck. On the back of the frame, there was a description that said the badge and gun were issued to Marshal Ketchpaw or Kitchpow. Ben's grandma had kept the gun in the family even after selling all the other guns that her late husband had collected over the years. She knew this gun had been used by a family member, but the story had faded over many decades. It appeared to be a Native American name, and even though Ben had done extensive research on American Indian tribes during his archaeology studies, he could not find any matches to any Native American surnames in any tribe. Some people on Ancestry.com said it was German. A Chicago police historical website said that personnel files were written on index cards somewhere in the Human Resources Department which were not kept anywhere externally and might require an extensive search. Ben put the badge and revolver research on hold for a later time or until more information could be discovered, but it has been on his list of things to do for about 10 years now. He did extensive research into the name Ketchpaw and found absolutely nothing. and was starting to think that the info would be impossible to find without physically going down to the police headquarters and searching by hand himself, which would have to wait until later as usual.